My name is Cassie Vance, and 3 days after I watched the soil settle over my mother's casket, I was told I had 24 hours to become a ghost. I was standing in the foyer of the Evergreen Ridge Lodge, the house my grandfather built with his own hands out of cedar and sweat, when my sister, Sloane, handed me a single sheet of paper. It was crisp, white, and cold. Behind her, the floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the mist-choked pines of the Pacific Northwest, a view that used to mean safety but now felt like an encroaching wall. Sloane didn't look like she had just buried a parent. She looked like she was closing a series of funding round. She wore a black turtleneck that cost more than my first car and a pair of diamond studs that caught the dim light of the afternoon. "It's better this way, Cassie," she said, her voice smooth and practiced, the same tone she used to manage PR disasters for her tech clients in Seattle. "We've already spoken to a listing agent. The market for timber frame estates is peaking. If we move now, we can have the lodge on the market by the weekend." I looked down at the paper. It was a photocopy of the first page of our mother's will. My name wasn't on it. Elena Vance's estate, including the primary residence at Evergreen Ridge, was bequeathed in its entirety to her eldest daughter, Sloane Marie Vance. I looked past Sloane to our father, Arthur. He was standing by the massive stone fireplace, his arms crossed over his chest, nodding slowly. Arthur was a pillar of this county, a man whose word was law at the local council, but in this room, he was just a spectator to his own daughter's cruelty. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He just stared at the embers in the hearth. "Dad?" I whispered. "Sloane is being sensible, Cassie," he said, his voice gravelly. "You've been up here for 3 years. You've lost touch with the real world. You need to get back to Seattle, get back to your career. This house is a burden you aren't equipped to carry anymore." I felt the air leave my lungs. A burden. That was the word he used for the place where I had spent 1,095 days changing sheets, crushing morphine pills, and holding a woman's hand while she screamed at things only she could see. Sloane hadn't been here for the burdens. She'd been in her penthouse, sending, thinking of you, succulents and sending $50 for coffee whenever I sounded too tired on the phone. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt a strange, cold clarity settle over me. I looked at the photocopy, then back at my sister. 24 hours, Sloane?" I asked. "We have cleaners coming at noon tomorrow," she replied, checking her watch. "I've already booked you a room at the inn down in the valley for a few nights while you find a permanent spot. It's for the best, Cass. You're a martyr, and martyrs eventually burn out. It's time to move on." She smiled then, a thin, brittle thing. She thought she had one. She thought the story ended on page 1. But as I looked at her, I thought about the silver SUV I'd seen idling at the bottom of the driveway for months. I thought about the errands my mother sent me on, the long, pointless drives into the valley for specific, herbal teas that she never actually drank. "Have you read the full document, Sloane?" I asked quietly. "Or just the page you're holding?" Sloane laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that echoed off the cedar beams. She shouldn't have laughed. Because to understand why that laugh was the biggest mistake of her life, you have to understand the Tuesday that started this war. The call didn't come with a roar, it came with a vibration on a mahogany desk in downtown Seattle. 3 years ago, I was a lead analyst for a firm that specialized in high-frequency trading. My life was measured in nanoseconds and quarterly projections. I had a view of the Space Needle and a boyfriend who thought a long-term commitment was a 2-year lease on a Tesla. Then my phone lit up with my mother's contact photo, a picture of her in her gardening hat, covered in dirt and grinning. She never called during market hours. She knew the rhythm of my life. "Cassie," she said, and the moment I heard the tremor in her voice, the digital ticker tape in my brain stopped. "I need you to come home. I need someone who knows how to keep a secret." I was in my car before the elevators even hit the lobby. The drive from Seattle to Evergreen Ridge is 3 hours of escalating silence. The further you get from the city, the taller the trees grow, and the more the modern world feels like a fever dream. By the time I hit the gravel driveway of the lodge, the mist was so thick I could barely see the porch lights. My mother was sitting in her favorite armchair, a quilt over her lap despite it being a warm September evening. She looked smaller. It was as if someone had taken a pencil eraser to her edges. "Stage 4, she said, skipping the pleasantries. "Small cell. It's already in the bones, Cassie." I reached for my phone to call Sloane, but my mother's hand shot out with surprising strength, pinning my wrist to the table. "Not yet," Elena whispered. "Don't tell Sloane yet. You know how she gets." I knew exactly how she got. Sloane didn't handle messy. She handled narratives. If I told Sloane, she would immediately call the best oncologists in the country, not for Mom's sake, but so she could tell her friends she was managing the situation. She would post a black and white photo of her holding Mom's hand with a caption about warriors, then she would disappear back into her life, leaving the actual, ugly work to whoever was standing closest. "I need you here, Cassie," Mom said. "Sloane is built for the sunshine. You're built for the ridge." I told my firm I needed a week. A week turned into a month. A month turned into a resignation. I packed my life into 12 cardboard boxes and moved into the guest room with the sloped ceiling and the view of the north face. I traded my spreadsheets for medication logs. I traded my silk blouses for flannel shirts stained with bleach and tears. I didn't realize then that I wasn't just moving home to care for a dying woman. I was moving into a trap. In my family, there was a very specific geography. Sloane was the peak, visible, shining, and distant. I was the foothills, the part you had to walk over to get to anything important. Our father, Arthur, had spent 40 years building a reputation as the most sensible man in the Pacific Northwest. He was the kind of man who measured the success of a daughter by the zip code she lived in. Sloane was in the city, I was back in the woods. To Arthur, that meant Sloane had made it, and I had stumbled. He lived in a separate wing of the lodge, a suite he'd built for himself years ago when he and Mom decided that a successful marriage meant never having to share a bathroom. He didn't do caregiving. He didn't do sickness. He would walk into Mom's room for 10 minutes a day, ask if the nurse had been by, and then retreat to his study to look at topographical maps. "How is she, Cassie?" he'd ask me in the hallway, never stopping his stride. "She's in pain, Dad. The new meds aren't touching it." "Well," he'd sigh, checking his watch. "You're handling it. You were always the reliable one." Reliable. It's the most dangerous compliment a parent can give a child. It's code for, I don't have to worry about you, so I can spend all my energy worrying about the one who doesn't show up. Sloane would call every Sunday at 4 in the afternoon. I know because I was the one who had to hold the phone to Mom's ear. Sloane would talk for 15 minutes about her meetings, her new interior designer, and the crushing stress of the city. "I feel so guilty I can't be there, Mama," Sloane would coo, her voice dripping with a sweetness that made my teeth ache. "But Cassie has everything under control. She's so much better at this stuff than I am. She has that nurturer energy." Nurturer energy. That's what they called it when I was the one flushing the PICC line at 4 in the morning while Mom vomited into a plastic basin. That's what they called it when I spent my Saturday nights researching clinical trials instead of going on dates. By the end of the first year, I was a footnote in my own life. My friends in Seattle stopped calling. My bank account, once healthy and growing, was starting to look like a disaster zone. Caregiving is a black hole for money. There are the things insurance covers, and then there are the things that actually keep a person human. The organic supplements, the specialized bed that didn't give her sores, the private nurse for the 3 days I had the flu and literally couldn't stand up. I asked Arthur for help once. "I'm on a fixed income, Cassie," he said, standing in front of his collection of vintage climbing gear. "We have to be sensible. Use the estate account sparingly." I asked Sloane. "Oh, Cass, I'm so sorry," she texted back, followed by a sad face emoji. "We're actually totally illiquid right now." We just put a down payment on a place in Palm Springs. Can you just make it work? You're so good at that. So, I made it work. I sold my car. I sold my stocks. I sat in the kitchen of the lodge at midnight, staring at a bank balance of $1,400, while upstairs, my mother's breathing sounded like a saw cutting through wet wood. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. But then came the afternoon in late winter, about 18 months into the illness. I had been out in the woods, clearing some brush near the driveway, when I heard the crunch of gravel. A silver SUV, the kind that looked armored and expensive, was slowly backing out of our driveway. I didn't recognize it. It wasn't the nurse. It wasn't the delivery guy. I ran up to the house, my heart hammering against my ribs. I burst into Mom's room, expecting to find her in distress. Instead, she was sitting up. Her hair was combed. She looked sharp. There was a scent in the room that wasn't antiseptic or lavender. It was the smell of expensive tobacco and old paper. "Who was that, Mom?" I asked, breathless. Elena looked at me, and for the first time in months, the patient was gone. Behind her eyes, the woman who had managed a multi-million-dollar timber firm for 30 years was back in the room. "Just a visitor, Cassie," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I need you to go into the valley. There's a pharmacy in North Bend that carries that specific blue cap lotion I like. Go now. I want a nap while the sun is still up." North Bend was an hour away. I looked at her, suspicious, but her face was a mask of calm. "Go on, honey," she whispered, patting her hand. "I'm just making sure the ridge stays standing." I didn't know then that the man in the silver SUV was carrying a briefcase that would eventually dismantle my sister's life. I didn't know that every time I left the house, the footnote was being rewritten into a headline. All I knew was that as I drove down the mountain, I saw the silver SUV pull over into a turnout, the driver watching me pass in his rearview mirror. He didn't look like a doctor. He looked like a wolf. There is a specific kind of silence that only exists in the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest at 3 o'clock in the morning. It isn't the absence of sound, it's a heavy, pressurized weight. It's the sound of the mist pressing against the cedar siding of the lodge and the ancient hemlocks shivering in the wind. In that darkness, the Evergreen Ridge Lodge didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a cathedral of grief, and I was its only acolyte. I sat on a narrow metal cot I'd moved into the hallway, just outside my mother's door. My back ached with a dull, rhythmic throb that had become my constant companion. A physical tally of every time I'd lifted her, turned her, or braced her weight against mine. This was the caregiver's fog. It's a place where time loses its linear shape. There is no Tuesday, no Friday, no next month. There is only the 4-hour window between doses of liquid morphine. There is only the sound of the oxygen concentrator, that rhythmic, mechanical wheeze that had replaced the heartbeat of the house. Every night, the ghost would visit. That's what I called the fear that lived in my mother's eyes when the sun went down. Terminal illness turns the world into a series of small, terrifying questions. Will I wake up if I close my eyes? Is this breath the last one I get for free? I remember one night in particular, the kind of night Sloane only saw in the curated photos I refused to send her. A winter storm had rolled off the Pacific, tearing through the valley and snapping the power lines like dry kindling. The lodge went pitch black, and the backup generator, the one my father had promised to service for years, groaned once and died. In the sudden, absolute silence, the oxygen concentrator stopped. I was on my feet before I was even fully awake. I lunged into my mother's room, the air freezing, my breath blooming in front of me like a specter. I heard her, a panicked, wet rasping in the dark. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't call for my father, who I knew was sleeping soundly behind the soundproof doors of the West Wing with a sleep mask and a white noise machine. I grabbed the emergency tank, my fingers fumbling with the valve in the dark, the cold metal biting into my skin. I remember the hiss of the air, the way the smell of pure oxygen cut through the scent of sickness. I knelt on the floor, pulling her thin, shaking body against my chest, whispering the same lie I'd told 1,000 times. "I'm here, Mom. You're okay. I've got you." Her grip on my forearm was like a bird's talon, sharp, desperate, and terrifyingly weak. She wasn't just holding on to me, she was holding on to the world, and I was the only anchor she had left. In that moment, I wasn't an analyst. I wasn't a daughter. I was a life support system. I sat there on the floor for 3 hours, wrapped in a blanket with her, watching the moonlight reflect off the snow outside. I thought about Sloane's life in Seattle. At that exact moment, she was probably asleep in her climate-controlled bedroom, her biggest worry being a delayed flight or a branding conflict. She didn't know the weight of a dying woman's ribs against her own. She didn't know the specific sound of a lung failing. She lived in a world of shoulds. We should get her the best care. We should look into options. I lived in the world of is. This is the medicine. This is the pain. This is the end. By the time the sun began to bleed through the gray canopy of the trees, my mother had fallen into a shallow, fitful sleep. I stood up, my joints cracking, and looked at my reflection in the darkened window. I didn't recognize the woman looking back. My hair was matted, my eyes were sunken into deep, bruised hollows, and I'd lost enough weight that my flannel shirt hung off me like a shroud. I was disappearing. Every hour I spent keeping her alive was an hour I spent dying myself. I was draining my youth, my career, and my sanity into the soil of Evergreen Ridge, and the most terrifying part wasn't the sacrifice. It was the realization that if I vanished tomorrow, no one, not my father, not my sister, would even know how to find the keys to the medicine cabinet. They didn't want the ghost. They just wanted the house to stay quiet. 3 times a year, the Queen of PR would grace us with her presence. Sloane's arrival at Evergreen Ridge was always a choreographed event. She didn't just drive up, she staged an entry. She'd roll up the gravel driveway in a rented luxury SUV, white, because it looked better against the green of the pines, and step out looking like she'd just stepped off a set. She always brought offerings. These weren't things we actually needed, like groceries or extra linens. No, Sloane brought the aesthetics of care. One weekend, she brought a hand-woven silk robe from a boutique in Milan. "It's for Mom's spirits, Cassie," she whispered as we stood in the kitchen. She was busy pouring herself a glass of the expensive bottled water she'd brought from the city because she didn't trust the well mineralization. When you look good, you feel good. It's about dignity. I looked at the robe, then at the sink full of stained towels I'd been bleaching since 5 in the morning. "Sloane, she can't sit up long enough to put on a robe. She needs a new hospital-grade mattress. The one she's on is giving her pressure sores." Sloane waved a manicured hand as if shooing away a fly. "I'll look into it, honey. I really will. But let's focus on the positive today. I want to take some photos of her by the window. The light is perfect right now." That was the performance. Sloane would go into my mother's room, spend exactly 20 minutes adjusting the pillows and the lighting, and then spend another 10 minutes taking candid shots of herself holding Mom's hand. Mom would smile, a hollow, ghostly imitation of her former self, because she loved Sloane. Or perhaps because she knew it was the only way Sloane would stay. By that evening, the photos would be on Sloane's social media. Spending a quiet weekend at the Ridge with my warrior mama. Distance is the hardest part of love, but the heart knows no miles. She'd get 300 likes in an hour. People would comment about how brave she was, how inspiring her bond with her mother was. And I'd read those comments while sitting in the hallway, eating a cold piece of toast, listening to Sloane in the next room complaining to her husband on the phone about how the woodsy smell of the house was clinging to her hair. The contrast was enough to make me want to scream. Sloane's grief was a brand. It was a tool she used to build her image as a deeply feeling, compassionate leader. My grief was a chore. It was the smell of rubbing alcohol and the sound of a laundry machine that never stopped running. But the most galling part was my father. When Sloane was in the house, Arthur transformed. He'd come out of his study, dress in his best wool sweater, and sit at the dining table with her, drinking wine and talking about the Vance legacy. "You're doing us proud in the city, Sloane," he'd say, his eyes shining with a pride he never directed at me. "Your mother and I always knew you had that spark." Then he'd look at me, standing by the stove, and his face would flatten. "Cassie, are we doing the pot roast? Sloane likes it medium rare." I was the help. I was the silent engine that made their performance possible. I provided the stage, cleaned the props, and handled the logistics so they could play the roles of the grieving patriarch and the devoted daughter. "I feel so guilty I can't be here more, Daddy," Sloane would sigh, leaning her head on his shoulder. "It's just, the firm is at a critical juncture. I'm the only one who can close the Davenport account." "We understand, sweetheart," Arthur would murmur. "Cassie is handling things here. She's built for this kind of work. She doesn't have your pressures." I'd turn back to the stove, my hands shaking so hard I'd nearly drop the pan. No pressures. Just the pressure of a human life resting entirely on my shoulders. Just the pressure of knowing that if I fell asleep for too long, my mother might slip away in the dark. Sloane would stay for exactly 48 hours. On Sunday afternoon, she'd pack her leather bags, hug me with a quick, airy squeeze that didn't involve any real contact, and leave a gift on the counter. Usually an expensive candle or a book of inspirational poetry. "Call me if anything changes, Cass," she'd say, sliding on her sunglasses. "You're doing a great job. Truly." And as her SUV disappeared down the drive, the silence would return. The house would feel heavier, the air thicker with the things that hadn't been said. I'd go back into Mom's room, put the silk robe in the back of the closet where it would never be touched, and start the next cycle of morphine. The performance was over. The audience had left. And the only person left in the theater was the one holding the mop. It started in the second year, right around the time the local hardware store stopped asking how my mother was doing and started asking if we were planning to sell the timber rights. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. Sleep deprivation does strange things to your peripheral vision. You start seeing shadows move in the corners of the room. You hear voices in the white noise of the oxygen machine. But the silver SUV wasn't a shadow. It was a top-of-the-line Range Rover, a deep, metallic silver that practically glowed against the dark, wet bark of the hemlocks. It would park at the very end of our long, winding driveway, tucked just behind a stand of old-growth cedar so it wasn't visible from the house windows, unless you were outside, clearing the drainage culverts. The first time I saw it, I dropped my shovel and started toward it. But as soon as I cleared the bend in the drive, the engine turned over with a muted, expensive growl, and it vanished into the mist of the valley road. I didn't tell my father. Arthur would have just told me I was being histrionic and needed to take a nap. And I definitely didn't tell Sloane, who would have used it as an excuse to talk about security concerns and suggest we install cameras that she would then monitor from her phone like a reality show. Then, the errand started. "Cassie, honey," my mother said one Tuesday afternoon. She looked unusually alert. There was a flush in her cheeks that hadn't been there in weeks, and she'd asked me to help her sit up against the headboard. "I need a very specific kind of tea. It's an herbal blend, mostly valerian and hawthorn. There's a specialty apothecary in North Bend that carries it. Mom, that's an hour and a half away. I can order it online." "No," she said, her voice firm. "I want it fresh. And while you're there, go to the bakery next door and get me those lemon shortbreads. I have a craving, Cassie. Please." I couldn't say no. When a dying woman asks for shortbread, you drive to the moon if you have to. I left my father a list of the meds she needed and drove into the valley. I spent 3 hours in North Bend, wandering through the apothecary and waiting for the cookies to come out of the oven. The whole time, I felt a strange, nagging itch at the back of my neck. When I pulled back onto the ridge, the sun was dipping behind the peaks, casting long, bloody streaks across the sky. As I turned into our drive, I saw it, the silver SUV, pulling out. We passed each other at the narrowest point of the road. The driver didn't look away. He was a man in his late 60s, with iron gray hair and a suit that cost more than my entire year of nurture labor. He didn't look like a developer, and he certainly didn't look like a friend of the family. He looked like a man who spent his life in boardrooms or courtrooms. I slammed on my brakes and watched him disappear in my rearview mirror. I ran into the house. I expected to find the front door unlocked or the house in chaos. But everything was quiet. I found my father in the kitchen, nursing a scotch and reading a forestry report. "Did we have a visitor, Dad?" He didn't even look up. Just the nurse checking in early, I imagine. Or someone lost. Why? The nurse drives a white Ford, Dad. This was a silver Range Rover. He was leaving as I was coming in. Arthur sighed, that heavy, theatrical sound of a man being inconvenienced by his daughter's imagination. "I didn't hear anything, Cassie. I've been right here. Your wound too tight. Give your mother her tea and go to bed." I went to her room. My mother was lying back against the pillows, her eyes closed. She looked exhausted, but her breathing was deep and steady. On her nightstand, right next to the morphine, was a small, leather-bound briefcase I'd never seen before. But as I stepped closer, her hands suddenly reached out and gripped the handle, her eyes snapping open. She didn't look sick in that moment. She looked like the CEO she had once been, the woman who had fought the logging unions and the state regulators and won. "Did you get the shortbread?" she asked, her voice a low whisper. "I did." "Mom, who was that man?" She didn't answer. She just pulled the briefcase under the covers, hiding it from view. "Cassie," she said, and her voice was suddenly soft, almost pleading. "I need you to do something for me. I need you to go into the library and find the old topographical map of the north section. The one in the red tube. Now." "Mom, it's dark." "Now," she insisted. "And don't tell your father. Just, go find it." I hesitated, looking at the bulge under the blankets where the briefcase was hidden. I turned toward the door, my mind racing through a dozen different scenarios. But as my hand touched the light switch, she called out one last time. "Cassie. When the time comes, remember that the map isn't the only thing I've hidden in this house." I walked toward the library, my heart pounding in the hollow of my throat. I didn't know then that the silver SUV was the first sign of a landslide. I reached for the red tube on the shelf, but my hand brushed against something else, a small, cold piece of metal taped to the underside of the mahogany desk. It was a key. And as I pulled it free, I realized it was stamped with a logo I recognized from my mother's old office, a logo that hadn't been used in 20 years. There is a specific kind of humiliation in having to beg for the money required to keep your own mother comfortable. It's a slow, eroding process that starts with asking for help with a copay and ends with you standing in a kitchen at midnight, staring at a digital bank balance that looks like a countdown to zero. By the 18th month, I had reached the end of my own rope. I had cashed out my 401k, paying the brutal early withdrawal penalties just to keep the private nurse coming twice a week so I could sleep for 4 hours at a stretch. I had sold my car, the reliable sedan I'd bought with my first big bonus in Seattle, and replaced it with a rusted-out farm truck that smelled like wet hay and wood smoke. Every cent I had ever earned as a lead analyst had been liquidated into oxygen tanks, specialized wound care supplies, and high-calorie nutritional shakes that Mom could barely swallow. I sat down with my father in his study. The room was a fortress of polished mahogany and leather-bound books, smelling of expensive scotch and the pine-scented oil he used on his antique climbing gear. Arthur was sitting at his desk, peering through a magnifying glass at a collection of vintage gold coins he'd recently acquired. "Dad, we need to talk about the expenses. The new adjustable bed arrives on Monday. It's necessary to stop the fluid from building up in her lungs. It's $3,000. Arthur didn't even look up from his coins. He just sighed, the sound of a man being asked to perform a tedious chore. $3,000? That seems excessive, Cassie. Have you checked the used listings in the valley? It's medical equipment, Dad. It has to be sterile and calibrated. I can't pay for this one. My accounts are empty. He finally looked up, his eyes cold and distant. I told you before, Cassie. I'm on a fixed income. Most of my capital is tied up in long-term timber investments that won't mature for years. We have to be sensible. Your mother wouldn't want us throwing money away on luxury items. A bed that helps her breathe isn't a luxury item. I snapped, my voice cracking. And I know what you spent on that coin collection last month, Dad. I saw the invoice on the hall table. Arthur's face hardened. He stood up, towering over me in the dim light of the study. That is an investment for the family legacy. It is my business how I manage my capital. You're too emotional, Cassie. This is why you couldn't hack it in the city. You let the numbers get personal. I walked out before I said something I couldn't take back. I went to the kitchen and called Sloane. I was desperate. I thought, surely, if I lay it out in black and white, if I show her the spreadsheets, she'll understand that the nurturer can't buy medicine with good intentions. Cass, honey, I hear you, Sloane said, her voice sounding tinny over the speaker. I could hear the background noise of a bustling city, the honk of taxis, the chatter of a high-end bistro. But Brett and I are actually totally liquidity poor right now. We just put the down payment on that place in Palm Springs, you know, the one with the mid-century aesthetic. It's an investment in our future brand. Sloane, Mom is struggling to breathe. I need $500 just for the end-of-month copays. Can't you just put it on a credit card? She asked, her tone shifting to that light, airy condescension she used on interns. I'm sure you have a high limit. We'll figure it out when the estate settles, I promise. Oh, I have to go, my trainer is here. Love you, mean it. The line went dead. I stood in the silent kitchen, the only sound the distant, mechanical hum of the oxygen machine upstairs. They were both lying. Arthur was buying gold, Sloane was buying real estate. They had decided, collectively and silently, that my life and my savings were the designated buffer for the family's discomfort. They were willing to let me bankrupt myself because, in their minds, I didn't have a real life anymore. I was just an extension of the room. That night, I went into my mother's room to give her the evening meds. She was awake, her eyes following me as I moved through the shadows. I tried to keep my face neutral, but the weight of the last 3 years was visible in the way I held my shoulders. Cassie, she whispered, her voice like dry leaves. Open the bottom drawer of the sewing cabinet. I did as she asked. Tucked under a pile of old patterns was a small, heavy envelope. Inside was $4,000 in cash, $100 bills, crisp and smelling faintly of that tobacco and paper scent I'd noticed on the stranger in the silver SUV. Use it, she said. And don't tell them. They think they've accounted for everything, Cassie. They think they know exactly what I'm worth. But they've forgotten that I was the one who kept the ledgers long before your father ever learned how to count. I looked at the money, then at her. She gave me a tiny, conspiratorial wink that broke my heart. She knew. She had been lying in that bed, watching them play their games, and she had been building a bunker for me right under their noses. The final Thanksgiving wasn't a holiday, it was an autopsy performed on a living body. Sloane had insisted on coming up. She said she wanted one last traditional Vance Thanksgiving for her social media followers. She brought a professional photographer this time, a young guy in a beanie who spent 3 hours adjusting the lighting on the turkey while I sat in the corner, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee and trying not to fall asleep. The house was filled with the smell of roasting sage and the hollow laughter of people who hadn't spoken an honest word to each other in a decade. Sloane was in full, devoted daughter mode, wearing a chunky knit sweater and posing by the hearth. Arthur was playing the gracious patriarch, pouring wine and telling stories about his glory days in the forest. I was the ghost in the kitchen. I had cooked the entire meal, the turkey, the stuffing, the cranberry sauce from Mom's old recipe, while Sloane curated the tablescape. Halfway through the afternoon, I went to the library to find a serving platter. The door was heavy cedar, and it swung open silently on its hinges. I stopped cold. Sloane and her husband, Brett, were standing by the window, looking out over the north section of the property, the part with the densest old-growth timber. The developer said the acreage alone is worth 7 figures if we can get the zoning changed, Sloane was saying, her voice low and sharp. And with the lodge cleared, we can put in 6 luxury cabins. It's a goldmine, Brett. What about Cassie? Brett asked, his voice sounding genuinely uneasy. She's been living here for years. She's given up everything. Sloane let out a short, cold laugh. Cassie is a martyr. She'll complain, she'll cry, and then she'll take a small settlement and move into a condo in the valley. She doesn't have the vision for this place. She's spent 3 years looking at the floor, I'm looking at the horizon. And your dad? Dad is already on board. He wants his share of the liquidity so he can move to that retirement community in Arizona he's been eyeing. As soon as the funeral is over, we list. We just have to keep the peace until then. I backed out of the room, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't just the house. They were planning to dismantle the ridge. They were planning to clear-cut the very trees my grandfather had protected. To them, Evergreen Ridge wasn't a home or a legacy, it was a line item. I went back to the kitchen and picked up the carving knife. I looked at the turkey, then at my own reflection in the window. I felt a cold, hard anger crystallizing in my chest. They thought I was a martyr. They thought I was a footnote. They thought I was so busy changing sheets that I hadn't noticed the vultures circling the roof. During dinner, I sat at the far end of the table. I watched Sloane feed Mom a tiny spoonful of mashed potatoes while the photographer's camera clicked in the background. I watched Arthur toast to the strength of the Vance women. You okay, Cassie? Sloane asked, her eyes darting to me with a flick of annoyance. You look a little intense. I'm fine, Sloane, I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. I'm just thinking about the horizon. It's funny how different it looks depending on where you're standing. Sloane's smile flickered for a second, a tiny crack in the porcelain. She knew I'd heard something, but she was too arrogant to think it mattered. She thought she had the power because she had the followers and the city address. She didn't realize that in this house, I was the one who knew where the fuses were hidden. I was the one who knew which floorboards creaked. And I was the only one who knew that our mother was still listening. 2 months before the end, the Pacific Northwest was gripped by a silver thaw, a freezing rain that coated every needle and branch in a thick, crystalline layer of ice. The world looked like it was made of glass, beautiful and brittle, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. Inside the lodge, the air was heavy with the smell of wood smoke and the rhythmic thrum hiss of the oxygen. I was sitting in the armchair by my mother's bed, drifting in that half-sleep state of the exhausted, when I felt a hand on my shoulder. It wasn't the weak, fluttering touch I had grown used to. It was a firm, grounding pressure. I opened my eyes. Mom was sitting up, not propped by pillows, but sitting under her own power. Her eyes weren't clouded by the morphine fog. They were sharp, clear, and terrifyingly present. It was the surge, that final burst of neurological energy the hospice nurses had warned me about. The candle's brightest flicker before the dark. Cassie, she said, her voice a low, clear bell. Get in. I didn't argue. I climbed onto the bed beside her, just like I used to do when I was a little girl scared of the mountain lion screaming in the night. I was mindful of the tubes, but she brushed them aside with a flick of her hand. I know what you gave up, she said, looking directly into my soul. I sat in this bed and watched you melt away. I saw your savings go. I saw your youth go. I saw you become a ghost to keep me from becoming one. I started to cry then, not the quiet, polite crying I did in the shower, but deep, jagged sobs that had been bottled up for 3 years. Don't cry yet, she whispered, pulling me closer. Her skin felt like parchment, but her heart was beating with a fierce, stubborn rhythm. I need you to listen. Sloane thinks she's the only one who can play a long game. She thinks because she's louder, she's the one in charge. But your sister has always been a sprinter. You, Cassie, you're a long-distance runner. She reached under her pillow and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a map. It was a business card for a man named Milton Vance Bryce. He's your great-uncle's son, she whispered. The family doesn't talk to him because he chose the law over timber. He's the man in the silver SUV. He's been here, Cassie. While you were in North Bend, while you were clearing the brush. We've been working. Working on what, Mom? On the truth, she said. Her eyes drifted to the door, checking for Arthur's shadow. Sloane and your father think this house is a prize to be split. They think they can evict the heart of this family and sell the bones. They don't realize that a house only belongs to the person who stays when the lights go out. She gripped my hand then, her knuckles white, her strength fading as the surge began to recede. Promise me, Cassie. Promise me you'll read everything Milton gives you. Promise me you won't leave this ridge until the final page is turned. I promise, Mom. I promise. She smiled, a tired, beautiful smile, and laid her head back against the pillows. The clarity began to drain from her face, replaced by the familiar gray mask of the end. She closed her eyes, her breathing slowing back into that labored, mechanical rasp. I sat there for a long time, holding the business card. I looked at the name, Milton Bryce. I thought about the silver SUV, the secret meetings, and the cash in the sewing cabinet. My mother hadn't been dying for 3 years, she had been preparing for battle. As I stood up to adjust her blankets, I noticed a small, red light blinking on the underside of her nightstand. I leaned down, my heart freezing. It was a digital recorder, tucked behind the baseboard, its tiny microphone pointed directly toward the armchair where I usually sat, and where Sloane usually stood. I reached out to touch it, but the floorboard in the hallway creaked. I froze, my hand inches from the device, as the shadow of my father appeared in the doorway. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, silhouetted by the moonlight, watching me in the dark. The funeral was held at a small, stone-walled chapel that felt like a cold cellar in the middle of January. Outside, the mist was so thick you couldn't see the mountains, just a wall of gray that felt like it was closing in. There were maybe 50 people there, local neighbors who remembered my mother before the oxygen tanks, a few of my father's hunting buddies, and a row of Sloane's colleagues who had driven up from Seattle in black sedans that looked like a funeral procession of their own. I sat in the front pew, my hands folded so tightly my knuckles were white. I was wearing a black dress I'd bought 5 years ago. It hung off my frame now, a reminder of the weight I'd lost in the trenches of the sick room. I felt like a stranger in my own skin. I smelled like the mothballs from the guest room closet and the faint, lingering scent of antiseptic that I feared would never truly leave my pores. Arthur sat to my right, his back as straight as a Douglas fir. He didn't cry. He just stared at the casket with a look of stoic resignation, as if he were attending a retirement ceremony for an employee who had put in a decent 30 years. But it was Sloane who commanded the room. She stood at the lectern, framed by a massive arrangement of white lilies, the very flowers my mother was deathly allergic to. I had told Sloane that on the phone. I had told her Mom couldn't be in the same room as lilies without her throat closing up. Sloane had sighed and said lilies, photographed with more gravitas. Now, they stood there, a blooming irony over the woman they would have choked. Sloane didn't wear sunglasses inside. She wanted everyone to see her eyes. Red rim just enough to look authentic, but not enough to ruin her makeup. She took a long, shaky breath, her voice amplified by the speakers until it filled every corner of the stone chapel. My mother, Elena, was a woman of the sun, Sloane began, her voice a perfect, melodic tremor. She taught me that life is about the view from the summit. I remember Sunday mornings, the two of us making blueberry pancakes in the lodge, laughing until we couldn't breathe. She was my anchor, my best friend, the person who understood my ambition because she shared it. I stared at the back of Sloane's head. We didn't have blueberry pancakes on Sundays. We had sourdough toast and silence because my father liked to read the Sunday paper in peace. And Mom didn't share Sloane's ambition, she tolerated it. She used to tell me, when Sloane wasn't listening, that my sister was running so fast she'd forget to look at the trees she was passing. Sloane went on for 12 minutes. It was a masterpiece of revisionist history. She talked about their special bond, about the deep, philosophical conversations they'd had over the last 3 years, conversations I knew had never happened because Sloane was only ever at the lodge for 48 hours at a time, and half of that was spent on her laptop. She mentioned Mom's favorite song was The Sound of Silence. It wasn't. It was Wildflowers by Tom Petty. Mom hummed it every night while I rubbed the edema out of her ankles. She hummed it so often I still hear the melody in the rhythm of the rain against the roof. She's at peace now, Sloane concluded, dabbing a pristine silk handkerchief at the corner of her eye. Because she knew she was loved. She knew that her legacy was safe in our hands. The room erupted in a sea of muffled sobs. People looked at Sloane with such profound admiration. The brave daughter. The successful one who came home to say goodbye. Nobody looked at me. I was the girl in the ill-fitting dress who had spent 3 years in the dark. I was the help who had been promoted to mourner for a single afternoon. After the service, a woman from the valley approached Sloane and gripped her hands. Your mother was so proud of you, Sloane. She talked about your career every time I saw her. You were such a good daughter to come all this way. I stood 3 feet away, holding my mother's old wool cardigan. It still smelled like her, lavender and wood smoke and the faint, sweet scent of the tea I'd driven hours to get. I felt a scream building in my throat, a primal, jagged thing. I wanted to yell that Sloane didn't know the color of Mom's eyes in the end. I wanted to tell them that Sloane had spent the last Thanksgiving calculating the timber value of the north section. But I stayed silent. I looked at Arthur, who was nodding at Sloane's colleagues, and then I looked at the lilies. The performance was perfect. The audience was moved. But as we walked out of the chapel and into the biting cold of the mountain air, I felt the business card in my pocket, Milton Bryce. The theater was ending, but the Real story was just beginning. The return to the lodge after the funeral felt like entering a tomb that had already been looted. The neighbors had left their casseroles and their blessings, and retreated to the valley. Now, it was just the 4 of us, Arthur, Sloane, her husband Brett, and me. The silence of the house was different now. The oxygen machine was gone, leaving a hollow, ringing void in the air. For 3 years, that thrum hiss had been the pulse of the building. Now, the heart had stopped. We were in the great room. The fire was roaring, but I couldn't get warm. Sloane was sitting on the leather sofa, still in her funeral black, her laptop open on the coffee table. She didn't wait for the tea to steep. She didn't wait for the sun to set. We need to be practical, Sloane said. The grieving daughter had been shelved, the project manager was back. Dad and I have discussed it. The upkeep on this place is astronomical, and with the estate taxes, it's not feasible to keep it in the family. She reached into her designer briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She laid it on the table between us like a challenge. I found this in Mom's desk upstairs, she said. It's a copy of her will from 2019. It's very straightforward. The lodge and the surrounding acreage go to me. Dad gets the liquid assets for his retirement. And you, Cassie. She paused, her eyes flickering to mine with a patronizing pity. You've been given a generous cash stipend to help you get back on your feet in Seattle. $10,000. $10,000. I looked at the paper. It was page 1 of a document drafted 5 years ago. It bequeathed the residence at 400 Evergreen Ridge to Sloane Marie Vance. It was signed, witnessed, and looked utterly final. We've already been in contact with a developer, Arthur said, his voice coming from the shadows by the bookshelves. They're willing to take the whole north section. It's the sensible move, Cassie. You've done your part, but it's time to move on. You have until sunset tomorrow to pack your things. The cleaners and the staging team will be here at noon the day after. 24 hours, I whispered. I've lived here for 3 years. I gave up my life, my savings, my sanity, and you're giving me 24 hours to vacate? You've been living here rent-free, Cassie, Sloane snapped, her patience finally fraying. Let's not pretend this was a sacrifice. You had nowhere else to go. You're a martyr because it's easier than being a professional. The word martyr hit me like a physical blow. It was the same word I'd heard her use in the library on Thanksgiving. She hadn't changed the script. She had just waited for the right time to deliver the line. I looked at Arthur. Dad? You're okay with this? You're okay with throwing me out of the house? I kept standing. It's the law, Cassie, he said, not looking at me. The will is the will. I looked down at the single sheet of paper on the table. No staple holes. No markers. Just a clean, photocopied sheet of paper that told the story Sloane wanted told. I felt a strange, cold calm wash over me. The fear was gone. The exhaustion was gone. In its place was the long-distance runner my mother had promised was still inside me. Have you read the full document, Sloane? I asked. My voice was steady, quieter than the crackle of the fire. Or did you just find the page that matched your ambition? Sloane squinted at me. What are you talking about? This is the will. I found it in the locked drawer. That's a copy, I said. I stood up, my legs feeling stronger than they had in months. And it's 5 years old. A lot can happen in 5 years, Sloane. A lot can happen in the hours when you aren't here. If you're suggesting there's another document. I'm suggesting you call Milton Bryce, I interrupted. He's the executor of the estate. Not you. Not Dad. And certainly not your developer. Sloane laughed, that sharp, bird-like sound. Milton? The cousin Dad hasn't spoken to in a decade? Why on earth would Mom use him? Because he's the only one in this family who doesn't see a forest as a dollar sign, I said. I walked toward the stairs, leaving them in the great room. Call him, Sloane. Ask him about the silver SUV. Ask him about the Blue Cap lotion from North Bend. And then, maybe, you should start packing your bags. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours in my mother's room, sitting in the armchair, watching the snow begin to fall outside. The lodge felt different, alert, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the morning. At 9 in the morning, the gravel crunched in the driveway. It wasn't the cleaners. It wasn't the staging team. It was the silver Range Rover. I was already on the porch when Milton Bryce stepped out. He was exactly as I remembered from the road, iron gray hair, a suit that spoke of quiet power, and eyes that had seen 1,000 families tear themselves apart. He carried a heavy leather briefcase. Cassie, he said, nodding to me. I'm sorry for your loss. Your mother was a formidable woman. She was, I said. They're in the great room. They're waiting for a different ending. Most people are, Milton replied. We walked inside. The atmosphere in the great room was toxic. Sloane was pacing, her phone pressed to her ear, while Arthur stood by the window like a captain watching his ship sink. When they saw Milton, the room went dead silent. Milton, Arthur said, his voice tight. What is this? Cassie says you're the executor. I am, Arthur, Milton said, placing his briefcase on the heavy oak table. He didn't offer a hand to shake. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Your wife contacted me 3 years ago, shortly after her diagnosis. She was concerned that the 2019 will, the one Sloane has been brandishing, no longer reflected her intentions or the reality of her care. Sloane stepped forward, her face a mask of cold fury. Mom was sick, Milton. She was on heavy narcotics. She wasn't in a sound state of mind to be changing legal documents. Milton reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. On the contrary, Sloane. Your mother was exceptionally thorough. Every meeting we had was documented. I have 3 separate psychiatric evaluations from independent doctors, all confirming her full cognitive capacity on the dates the amendments were signed. I also have witness statements from the visiting nurse and the neighbor. He laid the folder open. This is the original will from 2019, he said, gesturing to the left side. And this. He tapped a document on the right, heavy with blue ink signatures and raised notary seals, is the codicil. An amendment executed this past March. Sloane reached for it, her fingers trembling, but Milton held up a hand. I'll read the pertinent section for the record, he said. His voice was calm, professional, and devastating. I hereby revoke the bequest of my residence at 400 Evergreen Ridge to my daughter, Sloane Marie Vance. In its place, I bequeath said residence and all surrounding acreage to my daughter, Cassie Ella Vance, in recognition of the singular care, devotion, and financial sacrifice she rendered during my final years. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the snow sliding off the roof. I could hear Sloane's shallow, ragged breathing. There is more, Milton continued, his eyes shifting to Sloane. There is a no contest clause. If any beneficiary challenges the validity of this will or its codicils in court and loses, they forfeit their entire remaining inheritance. Sloane, you were left a cash sum of $50,000 and your mother's jewelry collection. If you file a lawsuit, you lose all of it. The same applies to you, Arthur. Arthur turned from the window, his face looking gray and aged. She gave the house to Cassie. The whole thing? Every board and every tree, Milton said. Sloane's face went through a terrifying transformation. The polish stripped away, leaving only a raw, naked greed that had nowhere to go. She looked at me, her eyes burning with a hatred that made the cold outside seem warm. You did this, she hissed. You manipulated her. You sat in that room for 3 years and whispered in her ear while she was too weak to fight back. You stole my house, Cassie. I didn't steal anything, Sloane, I said, and for the first time, I felt the weight of the last 3 years lift. I stayed. That's the difference. I stayed when there was no one else here to see the lights go out. Sloane grabbed her designer bag and her laptop. She didn't look at Arthur. She didn't look at Brett. She stormed toward the door, but she stopped at the threshold. She turned back, her voice a jagged whisper. You think you won, don't you? You think you can keep this place? You're broke, Cassie. You have no job, no savings, and a house that costs $10,000 a month to run. You'll be begging me to buy it from you within the year. She slammed the door so hard the glass in the foyer rattled. Milton watched her go, then turned to me. He reached into his briefcase one last time and pulled out a small, digital voice recorder, the one I'd seen under the nightstand. Your mother asked me to give this to you privately, he said. She said you'd know when to press play. I took the recorder, its plastic casing cold in my palm. I looked at Arthur, who was still standing by the window, staring at the empty driveway. Milton excused himself, promising to send the final probate papers by courier. I was alone in the great room. I sat on the sofa where Sloane had sat. I looked at the fire. I felt the weight of the key I'd found under the desk. I pressed the play button, and the voice of my mother filled the room, but it wasn't the voice of the dying woman. It was the voice of the woman who had been watching us all along, and the first thing she said made my blood turn to ice. The silence that followed Milton's reading wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. It sucked the oxygen right out of the great room, leaving Sloane gasping like a fish on a dry dock. For a woman who made her living controlling the narrative, she had suddenly found herself edited out of the final chapter. I hereby revoke. Milton's voice echoed in my head, a rhythmic chant of justice. Sloane's face was a study in geological shifts. The sophisticated mask of the executive cracked, crumbled, and fell away, revealing a raw, jagged desperation underneath. She looked at the heavy stack of documents on the oak table. The psychiatric evaluations, the notary stamps, the ironclad signatures of witnesses she hadn't bothered to meet. Every single page was a nail in the coffin of her plans for the north section. This is a fraud, Sloane finally choked out. Her voice was high, thin, and brittle. She was on morphine, Milton. She was hallucinating. She thought the nurses were spies. You can't tell me a woman in that state had the capacity to sign away a multi-million-dollar estate. Milton didn't even blink. He reached into his briefcase with the practiced grace of a man who had anticipated this exact tantrum. He pulled out a medical file bound in blue cardstock. This is the written assessment from her lead oncologist, dated March 12, 48 hours before the signing, Milton said, sliding the file across the table. He conducted a full cognitive screening at her request. He found her to be oriented, lucid, and possessing a sharper grasp of her financial affairs than most people half her age. Your mother knew exactly what she was doing, Sloane. She knew that if she left you this house, it would be a parking lot for luxury cabins within 6 months. Sloane's eyes darted to our father. Dad? Say something. She's stealing our legacy. Arthur stood by the window, his reflection ghostly against the falling snow. He looked like a man who had just realized the mountain he'd been standing on was actually a glacier, and it was melting. He looked at Sloane, then at me, then at the floor. I can't help you, Sloane, he murmured, his voice sounding ancient. I didn't know she'd gone to Milton. I thought we had an understanding. But there's more, Milton interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The no contest clause. Your mother was very specific about this. She knew the family dynamics better than anyone. If either of you, Sloane or Arthur, attempts to challenge this will in probate court, you forfeit everything. Sloane, your $50,000 cash bequest and the jewelry? Gone. Arthur, your share of the joint liquidity? Gone. It would all revert to the primary beneficiary, Cassie. The air in the room changed then. It shifted from the heat of anger to the cold, hard weight of a trap. Sloane was a gambler, but she wasn't a fool. She knew the math. A lawsuit in this state could take years, cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees, and with the evidence Milton had, she had a near-zero chance of winning. She was looking at the choice between a graceful exit with $50,000 or a humiliating defeat with nothing. She turned to me, her knuckles white as she gripped the back of the leather sofa. You think you've outsmarted me, don't you? You sat in that room, smelling of sickness and bleach, whispering in her ear, poisoning her against the rest of us. You're not a caregiver, Cassie. You're a scavenger. I sat in that room, Sloane, because you weren't there, I said. My voice was calm, a stark contrast to her screeching. I didn't have to poison her mind. I just had to let her watch the clock. She saw how many Sundays you skipped. She saw the photos you posted from the Hamptons while I was holding a basin for her to vomit into. You didn't lose this house because of me. You lost it because you treated your mother like a branding opportunity instead of a human being. Sloane didn't have a comeback. For the first time in her life, she had no spin. She grabbed her laptop, her designer bag, and her dignity, what was left of it, and stormed toward the foyer. Brett followed her, looking like a man who had just watched his retirement plan go up in smoke. But it was Milton's final gesture that stayed with me. After the front door slammed, sending a tremor through the cedar beams of the lodge, he turned to me and handed me a small, silver digital recorder. Your mother told me that Sloane would probably try to claim she was incoherent, Milton said softly. She recorded a final message. She said you'd know when to press play. I stood alone in the great room as Milton walked out to his SUV. I looked at the recorder. My hand was shaking. I realized then that the battle wasn't just about the house or the timber or the money. It was about the truth of the last 3 years. I pressed play, and the voice that filled the room wasn't the weak, rattling rasp of the woman I'd buried. It was the voice of the Sloane Vance I remembered from my childhood, strong, certain, and utterly unafraid. The aftermath of the great reveal didn't happen in a courtroom, it happened in the digital shadows where my family had always preferred to hide. Within 4 hours of leaving the lodge, the family group chat, a thread that had been dormant since the funeral, exploded. Sloane didn't go quietly. She went scorched earth. I need everyone to know the truth, her first message read. Cassie manipulated a dying woman. She isolated Mom from the rest of the family and forced a legal amendment while Mom was under the influence of heavy narcotics. This is elder abuse, and I will be seeking justice. I watched the bubbles appear as cousins, aunts, and uncles, people who hadn't set foot on Evergreen Ridge in years, started chiming in. Paragraphs about family loyalty. I sat in the darkened kitchen, the blue light of the phone reflecting in my eyes, and I didn't type a single word. I didn't have to. Because 30 seconds later, Aunt Ruth joined the chat. Ruth was the family's silent observer, the woman who brought casseroles and actually stayed to help me wash the dishes. Vanessa, she typed, using Sloane's middle name, the one she hated. Stop. I was there. I saw Elena every week for 3 years. She told me herself what she was doing. She said, I want the daughter who stayed to have the home she kept standing. If you want to talk about abuse, let's talk about the 24 hours you gave Cassie to become homeless. The chat went dead. It was the digital equivalent of a mic drop. But while the family drama played out on screen, a different kind of reality was setting in at the lodge. Arthur had retreated to his wing, the door locked, the silence over there sounding like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I was alone in the main house, and for the first time, I felt the crushing weight of the win. Sloane had been right about one thing: I was broke. My savings were gone, my credit cards were maxed, and I now owned a 5,000 square foot timber lodge that cost a fortune to heat, light, and maintain. I walked through the rooms, looking at the cedar walls, the stone fireplaces, and the ancient hemlocks pressing against the glass. I found the financial panic settling in around midnight. I started doing the math on a legal pad. Taxes. Insurance. Utilities. The numbers didn't add up. To keep this place, I'd have to find a way to make it pay for itself. I thought about Sloane's developers, their plans for luxury cabins and clear-cut vistas. The thought made my stomach churn. There had to be another way. I went to my mother's desk and used the key I'd found earlier to open the bottom drawer. Tucked behind the old ledgers was a file Milton hadn't mentioned. It was a conservation easement application. My mother had started the paperwork months ago. If I signed it, I would receive a significant tax credit and a grant for forest preservation, but I would never be able to sell the land to a developer. She had handed me the shield, but she'd also handed me the sword. A week later, I heard from Brett. He called me from a burner phone, his voice hushed and exhausted. He told me the truth Sloane would never admit: they were drowning. The Manhattan apartment was underwater. Their investments were failing. They had been counting on the lodge sale not just for profit, but for survival. She hasn't slept in days, Cassie, Brett whispered. She's pacing the floor, talking about how she's going to fix the brand. But there's nothing left to fix. We need that $50,000 bequest, or we're going to lose the apartment. Then tell her not to contest, I said. Tell her to take the money and the jewelry and disappear. If she files one motion, Milton will pull the plug on the cash. She's ashamed, Brett said. That's what this is. She's ashamed that Mom saw through her. I hung up and looked out at the ridge. Shame is a heavy thing, but it's not as heavy as the 3 years I spent in this house. I didn't feel sorry for her. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt done. I went to the mailbox and found a thick envelope from Milton. Inside were the final title transfer documents. I signed them at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd counted out morphine drops. As the ink dried, I felt a strange shift in the air. The house didn't feel like a sick room anymore. It felt like a fortress. The footnote had finally become the author, and I realized that the only way to honor the woman who stayed was to make sure this house never felt empty again. It is spring now on Evergreen Ridge, and the world is waking up in a riot of green and silver. The silver thaw of winter has melted into the cold, rushing creeks, and the mist that used to feel like a shroud now feels like a veil, lifting to reveal something new. I am sitting on the porch, in the chair my mother used to love. I finally replaced the cushion, The old one was flattened from the thousands of hours I spent sitting in it, watching her sleep. The new one is a deep forest green, the color of the moss on the hemlocks. The lodge is quiet, but it's not the silence of the dying. It's the silence of a house that is finally breathing on its own. I didn't sell the land. I signed the conservation easement, protecting the north section for the next 100 years. The developers stopped calling months ago. Instead, I've spent the spring working with a local nonprofit. We're turning the West Wing, the part my father used to hide in, into a respite retreat for family caregivers. A place where women like me can come for a week, for free, to sleep in a room that doesn't smell like a hospital and to remember who they were before the sickness took over. Arthur is gone. He took his share of the liquidity and moved to Arizona. He didn't say goodbye. He just left a note on the kitchen counter that said, "The lodge was always more your speed anyway." I think he was relieved to leave. He couldn't stand to be in a house that remembered too much. Sloane is in New Jersey now. They lost the apartment, just like Brett feared. She doesn't post photos of warrior mamas anymore. Her social media is full of rebranding and new beginnings, but she doesn't mention the ridge. We don't talk. We don't text. We are two people who shared a mother but never shared a life. I found a letter last week, tucked into the back of the family Bible. It wasn't from a lawyer, and it wasn't about the will. It was a note my mother had written to herself years ago, dated the day I moved back home from Seattle. "Cassie arrived today," it read. "She looks tired, but she's here. I think she thinks she's here to save me. She doesn't realize that by staying, she's saving herself. She's learning that the ridge doesn't just take, it gives. You just have to be still enough to hear it." I look out at the ancient trees, their roots buried deep in the rocky soil of the mountain. They've survived fires, storms, and loggers. They're still here because they knew how to hold on when the wind got loud. My name is Cassie Vance. I am 37 years old, and for the first time in my life, I am not a footnote. I am not a martyr. I am the owner of Evergreen Ridge, the protector of the north section, and the woman who stayed until the morning light. I won. Not because I was faster or louder or richer than my sister. I won because I knew that some things are worth more than a line item. Some things are worth the 3 in the morning vigils and the drained bank accounts. Some things, like a mother's trust and a home's soul, can only be earned in the quiet, invisible hours when nobody else is watching. The porch light is on. The coffee is hot. And for the first time in 3 years, I don't have to look at the clock. The ridge is standing. And so am I. If you're out there right now, sitting in a dark hallway, listening to a machine breathe for someone you love, if you're the one who stayed, and you feel like the world has forgotten you, hear me. Someone is watching. Someone sees the work you're doing in the dark. And one day, the mist will lift, and you'll realize that you aren't just holding a hand. You're holding the keys to the kingdom. That's my story. And if you're still here, listening to the end, thank you. Now, I have to go. The trees are calling, and for the first time in a long time, I have all the time in the world to listen.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe Family Files for more.